Backward pawn. A backward pawn is one that cannot be advanced with the support of a friendly pawn or protected by one. Although it isn't physically prevented from moving, it can't advance because it would be captured by an enemy pawn on an adjoining file. Its inability to move safely makes it a weakness in its owner's position, and a target for attack, as in Diagram 10. Protecting the backward pawn. Diagram 10 shows a backward black pawn on the b file. Black's b6 pawn is backward. The b6 pawn cannot advance because white's c4 pawn could then win it. But if black's king were in position to guard b5, which it could do if it stood on c6, and if white's king were not also guarding b5, the pawn could advance safely. Note, in Diagram 10, that white's c4 pawn actually holds back 2 pawns, not only black's backward pawn at b6, but black's pawn at c5, which can't move at all. Subject to attack. A backward pawn is subject to attack by the enemy queen and rooks along the half-open file in front of it. A half-open file is one, occupied by pawns of only one color. The half-open file facilitates queen and rook attacks because this long-range artillery is not blocked by its own pawns. In Diagram 11, both white and black have backward pawns, at b3 and b6, respectively. Neither pawn is in real danger, however, because the b file is blocked and can't be used by the enemy's rook. Neither backward pawn can be attacked along the b file, making your opponent suffer. When a pawn is backward and subject to attack along the half-open file in front of it, the defender's entire game may suffer, as in Diagram 12. Black's backward d pawn ruins black's game. In Diagram 12, black's backward d6 pawn is attacked by 2 white rooks and defended by 2 black rooks. But black's need to protect that weak pawn has given white a fine tactical opportunity to win the e-pawn. The e5 pawn seems protected well enough by the d-pawn, but the d-pawn is actually pinned. If it moves off the d-file, the black rook right behind it on d7 will be seized by a white rook. This allows white to capture the e5 pawn with the rook on d5. If black takes the white rook on e5 with his d-pawn, then white's other rook takes black's rook at d7. If black doesn't take the rook, white will move the rook from e5 to safety on the next move, staying a pawn ahead. In either case, white comes out a pawn to the good. A more resilient rook, white has the advantage but cannot force a win. Diagram 13 is the same as Diagram 12 but with black's rook transferred from c6 to d8. This more resilient placement averts the white rook's capture on e5, because black's rook at d7 is now protected. White still has positional superiority, though, because his rooks have greater freedom of action while black's are tied to defense. Piling up on the weakness, in Diagram 14, black holds onto the d-pawn for now, but white, with the move, can advance the e-pawn to e5, attacking the backward d6 pawn a third time. The d6 pawn could not then capture. White piles up on the backward pawn on e5 because if the pawn deserted the d-file, black would lose his rook at d7. No matter what reasonable defense black tries after white plays e4 e5, white gains a pawn on the next turn, capturing on d6 with his pawn from e5. Everyone joins in. Other pieces can join the attack against a backward pawn. In Diagram 15, white's rooks are supplemented by a queen, a bishop, and a knight, all attacking d6. In Diagram 15, black's d6 pawn is attacked 5 times, by all of white's pieces except the king. It's also defended 5 times, by black's queen, rooks, bishop, and knight. White's game is fully active, black's solely defensive. Moreover, with black's king side weaknesses, the position is ripe for a breakthrough sacrifice. If it is white's move, advancing the e-pawn to e5 breaks through the position. Black would either have to capture white's pawn on e5 or face the distasteful chore of defending both d6 and f6. Black's position is totally passive. After white's pawn advances to e5, if black takes white's e-pawn with the d-pawn, the rook on d7 falls to white's triple attack, 2 rooks and queen. If black captures the e-pawn with the f-pawn instead, white's queen can take on g5 or his bishop, exploiting the same d-file pin, can safely capture on e5 diagram 17. And now black's g5 pawn is unprotected and menaced and the kingside ripped open. Black's position is in ruins. The front line, the square immediately in front of a backward pawn, can be a big problem because it is vulnerable to enemy occupation. This occupation can be powerfully effective, since the occupying piece can't be chased away by a pawn. Diagram 18 shows a knight in that fortunate position. Evaluating this position, we see that black has a bishop while white owns a knight. A bishop is generally considered to be slightly stronger than a knight, but this case demonstrates the exception. Entrenched at d5, white's knight is a tower of strength, and black cannot drive it away. The knight is strong on d5, in fact, if it is white's move he can win the backward pawn on d6. First, white exchanges the knight for the bishop, capturing on e7 with check. After black takes back on e7 with the rook, white's rook captures the now unprotected d6 pawn. The tactic of driving away a defending piece or removing it by capture is called undermining. White, in diagram 18, actually dealt with both of the d-pawn's defenders at once. The bishop was captured by the knight, and the rook was diverted from the d-file by having to recapture on e7. Advancing the pawn, sometimes the particular features of a position allow the backward pawn to be advanced even when there isn't sufficient protection for it. Diagram 19 gives such a case. Black to move can rid himself of the backward d-pawn simply by advancing it to d5. Whichever way white takes it, with a knight on c3, the pawn on c4, or the pawn on e4, black has a tactical resource. The bishop on e7 goes to c5, pinning white's rook on e3 to its king on gl. After white protects the rook by moving the king from gl to f2, black will take the rook with a bishop. These transactions have cost black the d-pawn but gained a rook for a bishop. Giving up a minor piece, a bishop or a knight, for an enemy rook is known as winning the exchange. Trading a rook for a knight or a bishop is losing the exchange. Of course, if it is white's turn to move in diagram 19, the knight invades to d5, and black's backward pawn can't advance. White will then have time to reposition the rook and king. This should allow white to retain a slight edge. Strategy is often dependent on tactics. Pushing ahead, other tactical opportunities may make it possible to get rid of a positionally weak backward pawn. Diagram 20 provides an illustration. Black can get rid of his backward d-pawn. In this position, black to move can push the d-pawn, even though it is not supported by protectors. White could not then capture it with the e4 pawn, for black would then follow with a thrust of his own e-pawn, from e5 to e4. Double threat. White's knight at f3 is attacked by black's e-pawn, and both white rooks are skewered by black's g7 bishop along the LH8 diagonal. White must lose material. Bringing in the troops. Another way to alleviate a backward pawn weakness is to bring a friendly pawn to an adjacent file by capturing an enemy. Then the backward pawn might be advanced with the help of that supportive pawn. Diagram 21 exemplifies the situation. White has just captured a black knight on c6, and black has two ways to take back, with either the c8 rook or the b7 pawn. Erring with the rook leaves black saddled with a backward pawn at do. This pawn will then be subject to attack. By taking with the b7 pawn, black drives away white's remaining knight, and makes it possible for the d6 pawn to advance later, with the protection of the pawn on c6. Black should capture on c6 with the b-pawn, if you can get rid of a weakness by making a clever pawn capture, as in this example, in which a distant pawn was relocated to support a backward friend, do it. And when attacking an opponent's pawn weakness, try to avoid exchanges that eliminate that weakness or improve the enemy pawn structure. Knocking off the foe. Sometimes you can prepare to advance a backward pawn by exchanging off the enemy pawn that is preventing its advance. This is shown in diagram 22. Black can eliminate the backward d-pawn problem by advancing the f-pawn from 17 to f5. If white takes black's f-pawn with the e-pawn, black's bishop recaptures on f5, attacking the rook at bl. And when white's rook moves to safety, black takes the b-pawn with his b4 rook. Black can eliminate white's e-pawn, if white doesn't capture on f5. Black's f5 pawn can capture white's e4 pawn, which is attacked also by the b4 rook. White, of course, as well as black, has pawn weaknesses in this example, the isolated pawns at b2 and e4. Make it a safe occupation. The enemy pawn is clearly backward and you, the attacker, have a firm grip on the square in front of it. You can occupy that square with a piece, especially a knight, and that seems like an excellent idea. But before you do it, make sure that if your piece is captured, there, you will be able to take back with another piece, not a pawn. The reason will be clear in diagram 23. White should occupy the d-file with a rook before moving his knight to d5. It would be a mistake to play the knight immediately to d5. Black would take the knight with the bishop, and white would be forced to take back with a pawn. That would close the d-file to white's rooks, and thus eliminate white's ability to attack the backward pawn. In fact, it would no longer be a backward pawn. The correct procedure for white in diagram 23 is first to play a rook, perhaps the one on floor, to dl. This gains time because it attacks the backward pawn at d6. It also adds protection to d5. After black defends the d6 pawn with the rook, white then could move the knight to d5. If black should capture the knight, white would take back with the rook instead of a pawn. The d-file would remain clear for white's rooks as a channel to attack the d6 pawn. Good advice: try to avoid accepting backward pawns. But if you do get saddled with one, try to trade it for a healthy enemy pawn or two. Develop counterplay that prevents your opponent from attacking your weakness. This might mean exchanging pieces so that the half-open file in front of the backward pawn becomes blocked by an enemy pawn. In harassing an enemy backward pawn, first control the square in front of it with your own pawns and pieces. When suitable, try to occupy that square with a piece, particularly a knight. But if that piece is captured, be sure you can take back with another piece, otherwise you might lose the ability to attack the backward pawn.